Okay, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. This is Takeo HOSHI, Director of the Tokyo College, and today's webinar's moderator. The webinar is in English, but it comes with a simultaneous translation into Japanese. So if you want to listen to the simultaneous translation, please select your preferred language, in this case, Japanese, by clicking interpreter or a tsuyaku button in your webinar application. Many of you have attended Tokyo College webinar or seminar before, so many of you know what Tokyo College is, but just in case this is the first time for you to attend the Tokyo College event, let me start with a few words on the Tokyo College. Tokyo College was created within the University of Tokyo in February of 2019, so it's 5 years ago, with the purpose of generating new knowledge to contribute to the creation of an inclusive society and sparking deeper public engagement. Under the slogan, "Shaping a Shared Future Together," we have been inviting distinguished scholars and intellectuals from all over the world and having them give webinars like this. And today's seminar, I should say, today's seminar is very special because we have a special speaker. Bill EMMOTT doesn't need any introduction. He is a famous intellectual who has close ties to Japan and to the University of Tokyo, too. He has first built his career as a journalist at The Economist, where he worked from 1980 to 2006. He was the chief editor-in-chief from 1993 to 2006 at The Economist. And before that, he was also served as the bureau chief in Japan for the magazine. He has published numerous important books on international affairs, especially focusing on Japan and Asia. His first book, The Sun Also Sets, The Limits to the Japanese Economic Power, was published in 1989. So that was exactly at the peak of Japanese bubble. And clearly, the book describes the problems that the Japanese economy had back then and predicted the coming, what's coming, but what we know about as lost decades of the Japanese economy, looking back from now. So today's seminar is special because of a special speaker, but today's seminar is special also because Bill was a speaker at the first ever lecture at the Tokyo College back in 2019. He has been an Ushioda Fellow at Tokyo College and has been giving pretty much every year in the last 5 years at the webinars like this and the seminars at Tokyo College. And he's been also on the advisory board for the president of the University of Tokyo since 2006, I believe. So he has walked through 4 or 5 presidents at the University of Tokyo, and he's been a big supporter for the University of Tokyo. And I hear he was one of the strongest supporters for the initiative of creating Tokyo College. So I especially thank you for that. And finally, there's one more thing that this seminar is special, this webinar is special. That is, we usually do this webinar from a small studio in the Tokyo College with just a speaker, commentator, and moderator, with a couple of Tokyo College researchers to help us. But today, we are in a little bigger room with a live audience, some additional Tokyo College researchers to make the Q&A session more lively. So that's special. And this is where you go loud to tell the audience that we have some people in the room. Okay, good. Now, enough for my talk. And let's get on to the talk by Bill EMMOTT. Today's talk is titled The Future of Globalization, A History. So I guess he will provide a historical perspective to a big question many of us want to ask and help us clarify the issues. And this is exactly the kind of talk that we want at the Tokyo College. The commentator for today's talk is special too, our own Professor Naoko SHIMAZU. And she has been appearing in many Tokyo College events like this. Many of the audience know her, but she has a very distinguished academic career. And she was a faculty member at Birkbeck College in University of London for a long time, and more recently at the National University of Singapore before she joined the University of Tokyo and the Tokyo College last year. She is a well-known historian who focuses on international affairs. So I'm sure she has something to say about today's topic on a historical perspective on the globalization. So now I ask Mr. Bill EMMOTT to talk for about 40 to 45 minutes. And that will be followed by Professor Naoko SHIMAZU's comment for about 10 to 15 minutes. Okay. And for the audience of the webinar, you can write in your questions using the Q&A function, and you can do this during the talk. And I'll be watching Q&A on my screen and select some of them to share after the talk and comment. And for the live audience in the studio, you get to ask questions too at the end of talk and the comments. So let's start. Bill, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm absolutely delighted to again be invited to give a public lecture at this excellent institution of Tokyo College. And I give my thanks, of course, in particular to you, Professor HOSHI.
And you may want to turn on this your video here.
Well, I need to. I'm not sure that I'm supposed to do that yet.
Yeah.
Am I supposed to? Is that right yet? Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Well done.
Good.
Okay. So I thank you both for the very kind and generous introduction and for having provided me with this opportunity to give this lecture. And I thank the events team at Tokyo College for all the work that has been put in to make this lecture happen. Now it just falls to me to present the lecture, which is the one part that is outside the events team's control. So if anything goes wrong from now on, you all know who to blame. I've had the great honor to have been an Ushioda Fellow here at Tokyo College since 2019, as Professor HOSHI said. I'm particularly delighted that a visit to Singapore just before coming to Tokyo gave me the opportunity to meet Mr. Ushioda personally once again, and to thank him both for his support for me through this fellowship and, more important, for his invaluable support for Tokyo College. As many will know, my principal, and as Professor HOSHI said, my principal obligation as an Ushioda Fellow is to deliver this one public lecture each year. Although my time as an Ushioda Fellow began more than 5 years ago, this is only my 4th such public lecture, thanks to the unfortunate intervention of the coronavirus pandemic. The topic of my first lecture in 2019, as Professor HOSHI said, the first lecture in the college, was Envisioning a Far More Female Future for Japan, reflecting the work I'd been doing for a book with almost the same name that was published in Japanese in that same year and in English in 2020, and conveyed my sense of the welcome social and economic changes that I felt were underway in Japan. The next 2 lectures were much more international in their topics, although both reflected concerns which deeply affected Japan. In May 2022, my lecture title was Trade War, Pandemic, the War in Ukraine, What We Know and Don't Know About the New Political and Economic Order. The focus, if that is the right word for such a broad set of concerns, was on the way in which radical uncertainty has come to characterize the world we inhabit, and then on how, in such a world, preparation for a range of eventualities was much more likely to be relevant than attempting to predict what was going to happen and when. In July 2023, I continued with this theme of preparation rather than prediction, except that I looked more specifically at the task of deterrence and diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific if war is to be avoided over Taiwan. This very much reflected the big change in Japan's national security and defense strategy that had been announced by the government just half a year earlier in December 2022, albeit that announcement represented a culmination of thinking about threats and responses in Japan during the previous decade. The 2023 lecture also formed part of my efforts to think through these geopolitical and military issues for a book, which will be published in Japanese by Fuzosha Publishing in July under the title of, quote, How to Stop World War III, and in English that same month by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in their Adelphi series under the rather more sober title of Deterrence, Diplomacy, and the Risk of Conflict over Taiwan. I thank Tokyo College warmly for the part that giving that public lecture played in my work on that book. There is, I think, a clear link between those 2022 and 2023 lectures and my chosen theme this year. The link is the way in which changing geopolitics and socioeconomic convulsions are shaking up what has been thought of as the international rules-based order. Not just shaking the rules, but also seeming to make the economic outcomes look even more uncertain than they already were. As a result of that radical uncertainty about what might happen, in my view, of course, it is unwise to make firm predictions or judgments, but rather, as I said in 2022, to prepare for a range of potential outcomes and developments. This kind of embrace of uncertainty does not come easily or naturally to us human beings. We all crave clarity and simplicity, whether we are the media, scholars, politicians, policymakers, or writers like me. So we often find ourselves using, or at least hearing, simple words or phrases to describe the era through which we are passing, words which encapsulate a form of prediction or judgment. And the word which formed a catalyst for my lecture today is deglobalization. I'm trying to put up my slides. There we go. And I have to turn my camera, no, the camera on, that's good. Okay, so I don't have to do anything else. So the word which formed a catalyst for my lecture today is deglobalization. That word, which is being widely used as a description of our current age, can even take more extreme forms. I recently acted as discussant, the role kindly being taken for my lecture today by Professor SHIMAZU, at a talk in London being given by a Dutch analyst for the Atlantic Council called Elizabeth Braw, who has just published a book with a quite definitive title. Goodbye, Globalization, the return of a divided world. While it is clear that in many senses, the world is indeed now more divided than it was a decade or more ago, Ms. Braw is arguing for something more, that the phenomenon we call globalization, the growing interconnectedness of most countries on the planet by trade, finance, ideas, and technology, is a thing of the past. We have to say goodbye to it. The question which I plan to address in this lecture is whether this idea that we have to say goodbye to globalization is the right way to think about what is happening and what might happen. Or more strictly, I plan to ask what factors and forces might determine whether this idea, which is in fact a forecast, will come to be both true and meaningful. I will do this by drawing on some other times in history when forecasts or judgments have been made about the future of globalization. We therefore have the advantage of hindsight in knowing whether those forecasts turned out to be accurate and what actually happened instead. In choosing this approach and this title, I must acknowledge my debt to a great British scholar of war studies, Sir Lawrence Freedman, and the title of a book that he published in 2017, which was The Future of War, a History. Freedman's object was not to show how previous expectations about war turned out to be wrong, although many were, but rather to examine how those expectations had been shaped and what factors in hindsight turned out to shape the actual evolution of war. I think we can do something similar with globalization, even if my survey today of the future of globalization is necessarily much less comprehensive than Freedman's was of war, for the simple reason that globalization is a far more recent phenomenon than war. Yet the reason why it is a much newer idea is itself indicative, which I shall come to later. But first, let us return to the idea that we are in an age of deglobalization. I'm tempted to say that this must be true, for this publication, The Economist, with which I was for many years associated, has just declared that the world's economic order is breaking up and that deglobalization is underway. Its thesis brings to mind Ernest Hemingway's phrase about how one of his characters went bankrupt, gradually and then suddenly. That notion is certainly becoming common. At the board of an institution which I chair in London, I heard this same idea used recently by the specialists who manage our institution's endowment investments. Their key investment themes, they told us, are now 3 Ds: deglobalization, decarbonization, and demography. It's long been clear that the prefix de, meaning the reversal or removal of something, has become a theme of public policy in response to geopolitical tensions. China and the United States have both spoken about their desire to decouple their economies by reducing or even eliminating some of the financial, technological, and commercial connections between them. Diplomats, especially those who want to reassure corporate executives, have more recently replaced decouple with the word or phrase de-risk to show that this is not about complete separation, but rather about reducing elements that could be risky in the event of some political shock equivalent to the 2022 Ukraine war. Nonetheless, both decoupling and de-risking are quite a reversal for 2 economies which were labeled by the historian Neil Ferguson and the economist Moritz Schularik as chimerica, C-H-I-M-E-R-I-C-A, chimerica in 2006. So intertwined did these scholars believe that these 2 economies of China and America were becoming. To some in the audience, this idea may be reminiscent of Nichibei, the notion of American-Japanese interconnectedness that was briefly popular in the 1980s, with a similar idea behind it, that high Japanese savings were forming a perfect match with high American consumption. Yet in that reminiscence, there also lies a clue to the fragility of these convenient phrases or sound bites. Just as Nichibei vanished from use rather quickly once the bursting of Japan's economic bubble occurred in 1990, so Ferguson and Schularik soon pronounced, quotes, the end of chimerica in an article in the Harvard Business Review in 2009. That death notice was in one sense quite prescient, for it stated accurately, as we now know, that the global financial crisis of 2008 to 2009 was likely to put an end to the clear connection between Chinese over-saving and huge capital exports on the one hand, and American over-consumption. In another sense, however, we might wonder whether the speed of this death notice, just 3 years after the phenomenon had been given its catchy name, might cast some doubt on whether the phenomenon itself had any real meaning in the first place. This slide, third slide, shows a graph of US-China trade, taken from the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. Does this show either Chimerica in 2006 or the end of it after 2009? Well, the graph naturally shows a downturn in trade in the post-financial crisis recession, but then normal Chimerica service was soon resumed, with two-way trade still growing quite strongly. Then, at around 2018 to 20, we see some obvious fluctuations in two-way trade. First, when the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on most imports from China. Then with the pandemic recession, and more recently with further restrictions being imposed by the Biden administration. However, US exports to China have been relatively stable during this whole period, even though China imposed its own retaliatory tariffs, and the US has placed controls over high technology exports to China on national security grounds. Moreover, as a paper delivered to the 2023 meeting of the Jackson Hole Economic Symposium, organized by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, reported, something else important has been going on in the US-China trade. In their paper, Laura Alfaro of Harvard Business School and Davin Chor of the Tuck School of Business described not deglobalization, but rather what they termed the Great Reallocation. In response to the tariffs and other geopolitical factors, US supply chains appear to have adjusted quite rapidly, as have the production locations of Chinese suppliers. The result is shown on this rather complicated graph from their paper, but I can simplify such a detailed message by saying that what the paper showed was this. One, there has been a fall in US direct imports from China. Two, that there has been a corresponding increase of US imports of the same products from other countries, notably Vietnam and Mexico. Third, that there has been an increase in Chinese firms' foreign direct investment in those two countries. And four, that America's overall trade deficit did not change materially during the period studied. In other words, supply chains adjusted, but the overall level of international connectedness remained more or less intact. In this case, it was therefore not a case of deglobalization as such, nor particularly a case of decoupling, but rather one of reallocation. This does not, of course, tell us whether this reallocation was good or bad. The rerouting of supply chains may or may not have raised costs and added to inflation during the period studies. What it tells us, though, is something that should be obvious but often isn't, especially when discussion of the world's two great economic and military powers is concerned. It tells us that the world is not a binary construct between just the US and China. The same strange but seemingly unmovable binary assumption also used to bedevil discussions of US-Japan economic relations in the 1990s, when that was the hot topic. Americans in particular seemed oddly resistant to the idea that the world consisted of more than just two countries. To put it in the language of economics, what is being observed is trade diversion, not trade reduction or consumption. So it could be said, the first point I want to make about globalization and its possible future is that the clue is in the name. One of the key characteristics of the post-Cold War era, during which this term globalization has become widely used, is precisely that a larger and larger range of countries and regions have been participating in the relatively open trade, financial flows, and cross-border investments that have become possible. It is not a matter just of rising trade between a handful of big countries or economic blocs. So now that there are geopolitical tensions between the world's two largest economies, resulting in some barriers to their bilateral exchanges, this development alone cannot bring the system to a halt. There are too many options, too many countries, too complicated a matrix of commercial relationships to look at this as a simple matter of a movement being either in one clear direction or a reversal of that movement. Commerce, whether in goods, services, or finance, is like a river. If it meets a new obstacle, then it will flow around it, finding new routes and new levels. Certainly, a number of policies have been and are being instituted in major trading nations that constitute intended barriers against trade with certain other countries. The Trump-Biden tariffs against China, Japan's economic security legislation, President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act, both of which introduced large subsidy programs which favored firms producing in America. And the same is true of the European Union's so-called Green New Deal, and even more so of the new Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is scheduled in 2026 to introduce levies on certain imported carbon-intensive goods, such as steel and cement. And most recently, the Biden administration has imposed 100% tariffs on imports of electric vehicles from China. In other words, there is a lot of protectionism around. But does it, in the measures seen so far, amount to deglobalization? Data is naturally not yet available covering the most recent measures, but what we have seen so far suggests that at present the ideas of deglobalization, and even more so of goodbye globalization, are rather like the famous comment by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Solow that he could see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. For the time being, we can see deglobalization everywhere except in the trade statistics. We're better to go for trade statistics than either the Japanese-owned Financial Times or the World Trade Organization. Let's see if we can spot deglobalization in these graphs. The first one on comparing the annual growth in world trade and world output, or GDP, comes from the Financial Times. And it shows that certainly that neither trade nor GDP are growing as fast as they used to, but both are still growing. The next graph shows the volume of world merchandise trade coming from the World Trade Organization. Clearly a big dip during the pandemic, but now definitely still growing with some flattening, but a forecast for the next few years with a range of outcomes, but still at least positive. So this one shows the ratio of trade growth to GDP growth, which again still shows a positive relationship. We can't necessarily conclude that that relationship is causal. It may be correlative, but there's still growth, but at a slower pace. Another measure, world trade in commercial services by mode of supply. That picture of an upward movement in the graph looks much more like continued globalization than it does deglobalization. And the same is true even more so for digital services, shown in this chart. There's no deglobalization in the cloud, at any rate, not yet. So let's call it the deglobalization paradox. Everyone is talking about it, but there's no sign of it happening in an aggregate way. In these and the other graphs I've shown, we do see change. We see a period in which world trade in goods grew far faster than world GDP, but now we see their growth is more aligned with one another. We see the diversion of trade thanks to geopolitics and formal barriers, but not its reduction. We see services, especially digitally delivered services, taking over from manufacturing and commodities as the leading force in trade growth. Richard Baldwin, professor of international economics at the IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland, who I think it is fair to say is one of the leading analysts of globalization writing today, has argued in his 2016 book, The Great Convergence, and in a series of articles for the Center for Economic Policy Research, that recent trends before the war in Ukraine reflected two big things. First, it reflected a period of offshoring of manufacturing to China and new emerging markets in the 1990s and 2000s, followed by a new equilibrium in the 2010s and beyond, as those emerging markets came to consume a much higher proportion of their own manufactures. And second, it reflects an increasing role for information technology in making knowledge a prime ingredient of trade. That period of offshoring in the 1990s and 2000s is sometimes known as hyper-globalization, as trade expanded a lot faster than GDP. But on Baldwin's analysis, that had more to do with the combination of China's evolution and the impact of information technology on the way American, Japanese, and European companies were now able to operate, rather than on anything inherently good or bad globalization. It was an adjustment period, in other words. The New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman wrote a book in 2005 saying in the title of the book that the world is flat thanks to the digital revolution. Baldwin's analysis and those WTO statistics on digitally delivered services together confirm that 2 decades later, this is coming true. So perhaps you might think with some justice that I have used a sledgehammer to make this point, that as things stand today, deglobalization is not happening. International connectedness is highly affected by geopolitics, but it remains a dominant force in the world economy and indeed in the creation of new ideas and technology. But this does not, of course, guarantee that it always will be, nor that the deglobalization theories will necessarily always be wrong. So having looked at very recent history, let me instead take a look at a longer span of history to try to identify the forces that do make a difference to the future of globalization. So here, what could be called a history of globalization in a nutshell. There has, of course, always been trade, but really until the 19th century, it did not count for very much. And even the boom in trade in that 19th century was meager compared with what happened, as in this graph, with what happened in the 20th and 21st centuries. Prior to the 19th century, international trade was significant only when it came attached to empires, which by that era were mostly European. First Portugal, then Spain, then Holland, then Britain. And that brings 2 clues for the future. The reason why these countries became prominent traders is that they achieved technological leadership in sailing ship design and in weaponry. And then geopolitics in the form of wars between those European powers and between them and their target countries that later became colonies or settlements like the United States that became independent, began to determine the shape and growth of trade. But it was only the Industrial Revolution in the form of steam power and the use of iron and steel that really began what we can now recognize as globalization. Some economic historians date this globalization from 1820, a point when domestic price levels in Britain came to be set by international demand and supply. There was a process this had naturally developed over some time. Here, however, is an important theme. Globalization is driven by a combination of politics and technology, and the force that is too often forgotten or downplayed is technology. In the European-dominated world of the 19th century, the influence of politics was that war between the European powers took a lengthy pause between 1815, when Britain defeated France, and 1870, when Germany invaded France for the first time. That peace became correlated with the reduction of tariffs on trade led by Britain, though that reduction was not followed by the then rising but still small power of the newly independent United States. This period is often known as the first great wave of globalization. It also produced the first prominent forecast, or at least theory, of the future of globalization, when in 1912, an English author called Norman Angell wrote a book called The Great Illusion. In it, he argued that the new commercial interconnectedness of nations, by which he, of course, at that time mainly meant European nations, meant that war could no longer be pursued for commercial advantage, and that such were the mutual interests in trade that war really no longer made any sense, at least between the new industrialized powers. This idea matched a notion that half a century earlier had been propagated by another Englishman, Richard Cobden, himself a cotton manufacturer who was even involved in the founding of The Economist in 1843 as part of a campaign for free trade. Cobden argued that freer and more extensive trade between nations was the best way to preserve and extend peace. Angell's argument in the early 20th century was that this process had gone far enough in Europe to make old causes of war no longer rational. This may have been true in a sense, but now counts as the first great bad forecast about the future of globalization. The start of the First World War, as we now call it, in 1914, when Germany invaded Belgium and France, brought an end to the first great wave of globalization. Old causes of war turned out to have been superseded by new causes. Those 4 years of war brought great destruction to European economies too, as well as to their commercial relations. In what was at that time his most notable book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, the great British economist John Maynard Keynes wrote this lament at what, at least for the English elite of which he formed part, was a lost world. For Keynes, life before 1914 sounds like the telephonic equivalent of using Rakuten Ichiba or Amazon today. Technology had continued to make progress in shipping, aviation, and telephony. However, the 1914-18 war had destroyed 3 empires which previously had facilitated trade: the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Turkey's Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire, which ended in the Bolshevik Revolution. Through the financial punishments that the victors imposed on the losers, the war also greatly impeded international finance of all kinds, as well as post-war economic recovery. And then, after the technology-driven US economic rival in the roaring 20s, the Wall Street crash and banking collapses led to the Great Depression and a trade war led by American tariff increases in 1930. The world economy was still highly interconnected, which is why US banking collapses also brought down banks and stock markets in Europe. But the outcome was definitely a trend of deglobalization in the form of a sharp contraction in global trade, in world trade in the 1930s, as this chart depicts. Then, as we all know, came the Second World War, including the Sino-Japanese War. Following peace in 1945, the victorious powers established the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947 to begin a process of reducing tariff barriers and setting common rules. And financial institutions, including the IMF, the World Bank, and a new exchange rate system to try to stabilize finance. The result was a new boom in trade, albeit in a world that became divided by the Cold War. Politics enabled that boom, but what is often not recognized is that technology played a huge role too. And this chart shows the decline of transport and communication costs in particularly that immediately post-Second World War era. It used to be said in the era of imperial commerce that trade followed the flag. Given the role played by the dramatic falls in shipping, aviation, and telecommunication costs during the 1950s and beyond, we might reasonably say that during the post-war era, tariff policy followed the trade. The technological forces driving international trade acted as an enabling factor for tariff reductions and eventually in the post-Cold War 1990s for the universalization of trade rules and relatively low tariffs under the newly established World Trade Organization. This brings us to the era now known as the heyday of globalization. Japan had in reality become one of the earliest beneficiaries of globalization during its high growth period of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. But then China became the symbolic center of post-Cold War globalization. Even in that heyday, there were efforts made to describe or prescribe the future of globalization. I will discuss them briefly as I think they can be instructive. The first emerged from the US-Japan Boeki Masatsu of the 1980s. The Economic Strategy Institute, a think tank founded in Washington, D.C. by Clyde Prestovitz, a former US Commerce Department official, came to establish trade, as was advocated in this 1990 paper by his colleague Robert Kuttner. In some ways, the US-Japan friction had indeed led to managed trade through the voluntary restraint agreements and other measures between Japan and the United States. But whatever the policy-related arguments, the 1990s did not turn out to fulfill Kuttner's prescription. Most of all, the idea of managed trade really reflected an idea of a binary key trading relationship between what were then the world's two largest economies, the United States and Japan. But as I've already argued, this focus on bilateral trade fails to understand the now multilateral nature of trade in goods and services. Perhaps, to be fair, Kuttner and Prestovitz were making this argument before the impact of information technology on supply chains was becoming evident, and before the world became as complicated as it did from the 1990s onwards. Nonetheless, a very similar argument is being made today by the man who was Donald Trump's US trade representative during his first term, Robert Lighthizer, that the threat from China makes so-called managed trade both essential and inevitable. Japan's own great Kenichi Omai was and is much more in favor of globalization, what he called a borderless world, than Kuttner. In this 1995 book, The End of the Nation State, The Rise of Regional Economies, he can be said now, 3 decades later, to have been both right and wrong. He was right to observe that as trade barriers were lowered, and previously self-isolated countries like China, India, and others chose to join the world economy, so the natural bias of commerce towards trade with neighboring countries would be able to assert itself. Paul Krugman's 2008 Nobel Prize was won for his 1979 work on how scale and other factors give trade strong geographical biases, both within cities and between neighbors, if other barriers do not get in the way. As this chart shows, intra-regional trade has become extremely important as a share of total trade for Europe and for Asia. Much slower progress in achieving regional trade agreements explains why Africa and the Americas show lower shares for intra-regional trade. Where with hindsight we can say that Omai was wrong was in giving this regionalization such a dominant role at a time when other factors were also encouraging supply chains to be extended far beyond simple regions as IT enabled firms to combine their management know-how with cheap wages in countries far away. The world is flat changed things in ways that Omai, writing in 1995, perhaps could not have anticipated. Globalization has not, so far, turned out to mean regionalization. Nonetheless, the idea that the future lies in regional trading blocs is a highly persistent one. This paper from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in 2010 is just one example. Again, the idea contains some clear elements of truth, elements which have, if anything, become stronger as time has passed. Progress in renewing trade agreements at the multilateral level of the WTO has become essentially frozen, and the WTO dispute settlement system itself has been undermined by America's blocking of new members for the arbitration panels. So regional agreements, paramount among them, recently the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership in the Asia-Pacific, but also a New Deal in Africa, and of course, the ever-influential European Union, have become the name of the game in the setting of trade rules and standards. This focus on the regional level as the place for settling rules, disputes, and standards looks fairly well set, given the troubles of the WTO. But we should still be cautious in using that tendency to predict the future of a phenomenon as complex as globalization. The reason we should be cautious is that at current levels of trade barriers, regional trade agreements are important without being decisive. These blocks are important politically, but companies nonetheless find it perfectly possible to conduct trade within their supply chains across multiple blocks. Only if these blocks became far more exclusive with more severe and costly barriers would they really obstruct globalization. They surely do cause some trade diversion, but they are not the only force in play. So let me now make some concluding points that indicate the way in which I believe we should be thinking about the future of global commerce and the process we have called globalization. The history of globalization that I've outlined has shown the development of international trade in goods and services to have been driven by three main forces. First, peace, war, and international security. Second, national external trade policies. Third, technology and its effect on transaction costs. Let us take each in turn. It is clear that the biggest discontinuity in the growth of international commerce was caused by what we now know as the two world wars of the 20th century. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has certainly diverted trade and financial flows considerably, thanks to direct security effects and to sanctions. But neither it nor the other conflicts we can see occurring in the Middle East, Africa, or elsewhere have been sufficient to block global trade in a significant way. Tensions between the United States and China similarly have some diversionary effects and are to some degree echoed in tensions also between China and Europe and China and Japan. But these geopolitical tensions would have to get a lot worse to have a major effect on global commerce as a whole, in part because the world economy has become much more complex and multipolar in nature. The one conflict that would be very likely to have a major deglobalization influence would be a conflict between the United States and China over Taiwan. For such a conflict would very likely reach catastrophic proportions and would force many countries to choose sides. We cannot predict how commerce and the exchange of ideas would look after such a conflict, just as my European forebears would have been unable to predict the world after 2018 from the standpoint of 2014 or earlier. Secondly, nations' external trade policies. As I commented earlier, there has been a clear trend back towards protectionism since the 2008 financial crisis, one that has lately been reinforced by policies aimed at the energy transition and by US-China tensions. This has not yet, however, had a major effect on world trade. It could, of course. The big question is what would happen if Donald Trump is re-elected as US president in November and carries out his promise to impose a 10% tariff on all imported goods and a 60% tariff on all goods from China. One quite likely possibility is that other countries, including the European Union, the United Kingdom, Japan, and indeed China, would retaliate by imposing higher tariffs of their own, and we would be in a trade war, one that could escalate higher and higher. The wider that such a trade war became, i.e. taking in more countries, the likelier it would be to make deglobalization visible in the trade statistics. Nonetheless, we should bear one other thing in mind. This is that services, especially digitally delivered services, have become an increasingly important component of global commerce. How they would be affected by such tensions is unpredictable. Third, and finally, we need to bring in the related and vitally important force of technology. Falling costs and increasing digital capabilities have been a big factor behind the growth of global commerce. The entry of artificial intelligence means that there is no likelihood of this technological force for cross-border commerce diminishing. During the pandemic, the science and technology behind vaccine development, production, and distribution were all global, even if geopolitics introduced some distortions. Moreover, the basic reason why the US stock market has been driven by the so-called Magnificent Seven technology stocks is that the market for all of them is global. Geopolitics threatens, but as yet it does not decide. External trade policies at present divert, but only an escalatory trade war would be likely to have a major effect. Technology, however, remains the most powerful force in favor of continued globalization. The future of globalization will be determined by the interplay of these three forces. There is no currently predetermined destiny for globalization. Many commentators, in my view, overplay the influence of politics and underplay the role of technology. Extreme outcomes are possible and need to be prepared for, but we must above all keep an open mind as to what the actual outcome will be. Thank you very much for listening, ladies and gentlemen. I look forward to the discussion and to Professor Shimazu's comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Let's go to Professor Naoko for the,
Before she starts,
yeah.
I just want to ask for my instructions on what to do with the computer. Can I just leave it or turn my camera on or off? Do I need to do anything? I can leave it. Okay, I didn't want to do the wrong thing and divert from Professor Shimazu's.
Okay.
Okay, apologies.
So, Mr. Naoko,
Yes.
Shimazu.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Yes.
Oh, stop sharing the screen. Right. So how do I do that?
The red thing.
Oh, that
Yeah,
red thing. Oh, yes, thank you. There we are. Perfect. Okay.
Well, there's technology for you.
Yes.
Yes, for us
Exactly.
all.
Very powerful.
Yes, it's very powerful. So thank you very much, Bill, for the most enlightening and thought-provoking lecture with a provocative title, to which I'll come back to at the end of my comments. So the idea that the world is becoming increasingly interdependent is not new. In 1848, for instance, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, in the Communist Manifesto, famously stated that, and I quote here, "In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence of nations." Sorry.
Oh, look this way.
Oh, I see. Sorry. I'm still here. Right, so I'm going to start the quote again, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. In place of the old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have intercourse in every direction, universal interdependence, interdependence of nations. The intellectual creations of individual nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, end quote. So what is striking is the sense of urgency we feel in this statement, that the world was changing at an extraordinary pace, underpinned by changes in the modes of production due to capitalistic growth, fueled by industrialization and concomitantly imperial expansion. And it is full of emotions. Now, the age of empire did help to expedite the sense of interconnectedness as shipping routes became increasingly connected with different regions of the world, as the economic needs of the empire facilitated migration of peoples, and of course, many of them forced migrations, and boosted trade largely for the benefit of the imperialists. Now, port cities such as Shanghai, Singapore, Bombay, and even New Orleans thrived as centers of confluence. As John Darwin's recent book, Unlocking the World, Port Cities and Globalization in the Age of Steam, 1830 to 1930, published in 2020, connecting the farther reaches of the world. Now, with hindsight, the term globalization might have gone down rather well with the 19th century era of high imperialism, as the perceived status of an imperial power became dependent on both economic and military prowess. Nevertheless, the term globalization is relatively new, only dating back to the early 1990s. As a doctoral student at the time, I was studying international relations in the United Kingdom and attended a conference where a scholar by the name of Jan Art Scholter, who was then at the University of Sussex, and I think he's at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands now, presented a research paper on globalization, and in the title of this paper. And the thing is, many of us sat there gaping at the audacity of the idea. And one prominent professor of international relations, who shall remain nameless here, pointed out how nonsensical the whole idea was. We were still reeling from the immediate aftershock of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which hardly anyone studying international relations had predicted would happen, so deeply steeped as we were in the indestructibility of the bipolar world. I remember vividly to this day the atmosphere, even the lighting in that conference room. So paradigm-changing ideas tend to be imbued with emotions, in my experience. So Bill, you've argued that globalization is, here in your own words, determined by the interplay of these three forces, which are geopolitics, external trade policies, and technology. I agree that these three factors are very important. Geopolitics is a global given, though its contingent nature, premised on the precarity of power relations, does cause ruptures in global politics and destabilize global and regional order. And the same goes for external trade policies, which can cause more protectionist measures, undermining global trade. The example of Brexit, and I had to bring in Brexit somewhere in my comments, and the problematic legacy of having to deal with the legal disentangling regarding the minutiae of legislations governing British trade as part of the European Union is a case in point. When the Brexiteers were campaigning, in 2016, nobody had bothered to think about the extremely cumbersome legal implications of withdrawing from the European Union. In fact, this is a high-profile example of how economic integration in the 21st century is not just about economics, but about legal integration as well. Unraveling it is taking nearly a decade since the Brexit vote in 2016. It is a total nightmare because it is trying to entangle the intricately intermeshed legal regime created with an express view of a committed long-term integration. Out of the three factors, I cannot agree with you more on your point about technology as the greatest motor of continued globalization. Indeed, it is technological advancement, for better or worse, which lends itself to increased integration, or at least fosters the perception that it has. So more on this later. But I think what I would like to say is that globalization is a condition that we live in today. This is why I personally think that deglobalization, as some commentators have noted, and as mentioned by Bill in his lecture, is not an appropriate term to posit as a countervailing idea to globalization. It is because globalization is much about the process of change occurring in the way our societies are engaging with one another, as it is about the ideational description of the social reality in which some of us have come to believe that we live in. This is why it simply does not make sense to deglobalize, because it assumes that we can somehow undo what we have done, and that act of undoing is even possible and realizable. So it draws a starkly simplistic dichotomous picture of the pendulum swimming back and forth between globalization and deglobalization and so on, as though these two were the only conditions that can exist or are indeed desirable. So how are we to go back to the age of innocence, if we can call it as such, the world of pre-internet, pre-social web? We cannot undo what we do. Now, as the social theorist Zygmunt Bauman wrote in his well-known treatise on globalization in 1998, whether we like it or not, we now live in an increasingly globalized world. Whether we are being pulled more towards the local or more towards the global, the fact remains that these two pulling factors are the two fundamental constituents of globalization. Normatively, we are moving away from the early halcyon days when globalization began to appear in popular lexicon, when becoming global had an aspirational value, to a time over 3 decades later, when we may be oscillating more towards appreciating the value of the local within the globalized world. Now, I'd like to come back to the role technology has played in creating both the semblance and the reality of a globalized world. Access to technology, which by no means is equal at all, has enabled connectivity and mobility on a major scale, both as reflections of the connected nature of the social reality in which we live, and as ideas which fuel popular and political imagination. True enough, one could argue that connectivity and mobility had always been there in human history, and it is all a matter of degree. Nevertheless, we cannot deny that even if one were to be strongly locally bound, social web, for example, can offers us access to unprecedented level of information about others outside of one's locality. In a similar vein, however divided we might feel, we cannot be isolated from technological globality that has become so dominant in our societies. It is nearly impossible to deglobalize because the entire underlying edifice of our existence rests on technological connectedness. Indeed, this informational connectedness has produced the illusion that we, as inhabitants of the earth, are better connected with each other. Importantly, we have an increasingly strong sense increasingly strong sense that we share planetary destinies. The idea of global commons of one kind or another is becoming more grounded in our everyday thinking. Foremost is the idea that the environment is the common responsibility of all of us on this planet. Again, the idea of the environmental common and the ecology as a common global concern gained popular coinage relatively recently, notwithstanding the warnings from the experts and environmentalists for decades before. So whatever the future beholds, we can never turn back the clock. History does not repeat itself, at least in the literal sense of the word. Constellations of political power change over time, and wars come and go over human history. Unless we are talking about catastrophic wars which change the ecology of our planet, can geopolitics really change the course of the increasingly globalized world, I wonder? Now, perhaps we're at a stage where globalization, or the globalized condition of the world, is greater than the sum of its parts. And this brings me back to the title of your lecture, Bill, The Future of Globalization, a History. Obviously, as a historian, I particularly appreciated the secondary title of your lecture, A History. Yet, it is also the juxtaposition you make of history with the word future in the main title that intrigues, whilst at the same time confounds. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on this, because I think that you may be hinting at something more than you're letting on here. Thank you once again, Bill, for your most excellent lecture. And if you have any thoughts on my comments, I'd be more than gladly hear them and think about them. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Naoko. Bill, do you want to respond before we take questions?
Well, I shall respond very briefly by saying I think thank Naoko for her excellent comments. She's a much better historian, of course, than I can be, and I think the sense of positioning. What I particularly liked was the sense of positioning thoughts of the future in the nature of the change that people are going through at the time, which was what, as you say, Marx and Engels were writing about, and others. And as I commented privately before, a former colleague of mine at the Economist wrote an excellent book called The Victorian Internet, which was about the impact of the electronic telegraph, Tom Standage, the impact of the electronic telegraph in the mid-19th century on social relationships, and how many of the scares and issues related to it were exactly the same in nature as what happened with the internet, and that this moments of change that we become particularly conscious of. In terms of the further looking at the history of expectations about globalization, it's that I would sort of like to look at, and to understand how people saw these changes that were swirling thanks to technology, thanks to changing politics, sometimes thanks to changing external trade policies, how they perceived those changes and responded to them. And then the way in which they responded, of course, affected what future actually happened. And I think that that's what could be a rich way of looking at like globalization as a rather broad phenomenon, but as a pace of a word which captures the sense of like sometimes destabilizing change that we go through in many phases.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bill, for the great talk and answering many questions. Some of them are not closely related to your talk. And I also thank Professor Naoko SHIMAZU for excellent comments and all the on-site participants for discussion, and also online audience for asking very good questions. And finally, I'd like to thank two researchers at the Tokyo College for delivering this webinar. We didn't hear from them, but they did a great job, Evan Koike and Flavia Baldari. Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to close this webinar. Thank you very much.